Since the standardization of the Beatles catalog in 1987, when the move was made to CD, the United States albums, which have all been truncated and reproduced and altered, those would become the redheaded stepchildren of the Beatles catalog. And they're relegated to low status, unimportant, don't listen to these. But the fact of the matter is that some of the United States versions, I think, are better than the UK counterparts. I think Meet the Beatles is one of them. Now, one of the things people forget, I think, or don't realize is that Meet the Beatles was the most listened to version of this album in the world. There is no bigger sales anywhere than in the United States, and this was burned into the brains of many of us. And I think it's time to reassess the value of some of these United States releases, particularly this one. So the physical album, let's have a look at this here. Now, this album was released right around the Ed Sullivan Show, and it gives the impression that it was the first album by the Beatles, but technically, it was the second album. The first album was Introducing the Beatles, which was released 10 days before this one on the VJ label. Now, I've got a video on that album as well. I consider that their first masterpiece. This album came hot on the heels of that, and there's plenty of excitement and plenty of demand for two albums to really compete and sell tons, which both did. Now, one of the things that is striking about this album is of the many iconic album covers the Beatles have, this photograph is the first iconography that we have from them. And they wanted to mimic the style of Astrid Kirchner, their friend from Hamburg, who took all those great black and white photos when they were in Germany. And the first album, Please Please Me, which is pretty pop, it was a typical pop album cover. They wanted to go away from that. And it's important to know that the Beatles were very involved in their art direction from the very early days, and they always wanted to go against the grain. In fact, what they wanted to do with this album was to have a full bleed, no artist names, no artist credits, just their photos on it, but EMI rejected that immediately. Now let's compare the two albums, Meet the Beatles and With the Beatles. One of the things that I'm fully aware of is that the album that you grow up with, that's typically your preferred listening preference. So whether you grew up with the Beatles or Meet the Beatles, or you're going to get people that love both, and I completely understand that. But in the case of Meet the Beatles, I think this is a case where less is more. And one of the things that makes this a better compilation is that the singles are included on here, and that you also have all originals except for one song. So what I mean by less is more in this instance is that the Beatles, or I should say Capitol, trimmed the With the Beatles version from 14 songs to 12, and they went with almost all originals except for one. And here's the track listing. So on side one we've got I Want to Hold Your Hand, I Saw Her Standing There, This Boy, It Won't Be Long, All I've Got to Do and All My Loving. Second side, Don't Bother Me, George Harrison sung Leading Off, which is a great lead-off song. Little Child, Till There Was You, the lone cover song. Hold Me Tight, I Want to Be Your Man, and Not a Second Time. Let's start with the big hit. I mean, I Want to Hold Your Hand was a genre-changing song, and Capitol Records had rejected all their earlier singles. In fact, they did not want anything to do with I Want to Hold Your Hands. They even had a court order to keep it from being played, if you can believe that. That's a topic for another video. But Capitol completely lost out because this song was so infectious, and once it got rolling, there was no stopping it. So I Want to Hold Your Hand became one of the biggest hits of the rock era. And the B-side was I Saw Her Standing There, which went to number 14, which is another great song. Another single that was pulled from this album is All My Loving, which only hit number 45 in the United States. It was released in Canada. On the B-side, This Boy hit number 1 there. But this boy wants you back again. All my loving, I will send to you. All my loving. Now, All My Loving is just a brilliant pop song. It stands up to all their early hits and probably their later hits as well. It's no surprise to me that This Boy hit number 1 in Canada. I mean, their first real 3-part harmony on record. It's absolutely killer. What a great song. This album provides plenty of punch with these rockin' originals. It won't be long, yeah, 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 yeah. It won't be long, yeah, yeah, yeah. So Obviously, I Want to Be Your Man was a hit for the Stones. It was their first top 10 hit. So the Beatles were starting to write for other artists, and people were picking up on the whole Beatle bandwagon, and there just was a momentum that just was unstoppable during these early periods. Balancing the hard-edged, danceable songs, they also had some somber, introspective songs as well.
Whenever I want you around, yeah. So go away, leave me alone, don't bother me. No, 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 not a second time.
Now, among these three originals, John's All I've Got to Do is one of his more heartfelt songs. George Harrison chips in with Don't Bother Me, which is pretty typical George, but I think it's a quality song. And it's not the bouncy, upbeat song. It's kind of a little bit dark, I would say. Similar, I would say, about Not a Second Time. That one also has a little bit of a bluesy edge to it, at least in the lyrics. Now, the lone cover song on this is Till There Was You. That's from The Music Man. Beautiful ballad sung by Paul, and one of George Harrison's great guitar solos. And you can tell he really worked on this solo because he just plays it with pinpoint precision. And when you hear the live versions, he's every bit as good as the studio cut.
Till there was you.
American audiences really got a heavy dose of who the Beatles were with this album. I mean, they presented themselves as a self-contained band, playing all their own material, writing all of it except for one song, and I think that really carried a lot of weight. And this was an early stage that the Beatles were doing this. Most people point to the next album as being the album that has all the first time that it's all originals, but from an American perspective, this was pretty darn close. The covers that appear on With the Beatles were probably better done live than they were in the studio. There's a couple weak moments there. And with Meet the Beatles, I have no idea how Capitol chose these songs, but for all the hammering that people do on Capitol for butchering all these albums, Dave Dexter got this one right, so I think he should be given credit for it. One of the other things I wanted to mention is that the Beatles are oftentimes called a studio band once they stopped touring, but really if you listen to this early material, they were really a studio band right from the very beginning. I think it's fair to say that the Capitol records lack an overall sound, but song for song, I would rate this as better than its British counterpart. Now let's look at some of the covers here. We've got the weak songs on here for me are Roll Over Beethoven and Devil in Her Heart. Those are both sung by George Harrison. I thought those were poor choices for this album. I don't know what they could have done in its place. They had some other songs they could have done. I mean, Some Other Guy is one of those songs that I always wish they would have recorded in the studio. The other covers on here, Money is a great one. Please Mr. Postman, great. But I get the feeling I just like the other version more. Like I said, in this case, I think less is more. Now, one of the things I always like to do when I'm reviewing the Beatles, and I'm going to start doing as I do more of the Beatles material, is I'm going to ask the question, what could they have done better? I mean, people don't really ask that. We just say, well, these are classics and we can't say anything bad about them. But really, there's always room for improvement. Now, one of the things I would say, let's go back to the cover. And this wonderful photograph, I would say that this is a much better look. In the Capitol version, they couldn't help themselves but put a little bit of blue in here. And this is like an olive drab color in the name Beatles. And the whole tint of the photograph is blue, which didn't need to be done. I mean, you could have kept it black and white. One of the things I don't like about this cover is the title, With the Beatles. I can't think of a dumber name. I think it's the worst title for any Beatle album of their own titles that they come up with. Where they did pay attention to the artwork and the art production on this photograph was wonderful, but I wish they had put a little more thought into the title of the album. The running order of the Meet the Beatles, I mean, they've got I Want to Hold Your Hand leading off, which they were taking no chances, I guess, but really I Saw Her Standing There. Is that not the ultimate lead-off song? Should that not lead this album off? That would be better. I do like the fact that All My Lovin' does close side one, and Don't Bother Me opens side two. I think those are wonderful, wonderful track listings. Now, people often assume that the reason Capitol or other record companies in the United States that only put 11 or 12 songs per per album had to do with greed and just milking other albums. I don't think that was really the case as much as it was how royalties were distributed. They were done differently in both countries. And when in the United States anyway, by putting the singles on the albums, you were going to generate more sales anyway. So you didn't need quantity, you just needed quality. And in the United States, anyway, I don't know, it might have been different in Europe, but there were really two different buyers. So younger people, kids, were buying 45s. And those were well under $1. Even when I was buying 45s as a kid, I think they were 95 cents or something. Albums were in the $4 range, so that was more of an expensive product. But you really had enough people here buying so much that it could really handle two different types of buyers. I think that's also part of the reason why singles were put on the albums. One of the things that I've noticed I came up in the 70s, and that's when stereos got a lot better quality. In the 60s, you still had the record players, the phonographs that dropped the records down, slapped them onto each other, and they weren't real sophisticated or real high-tech in terms of quality. That changed in the 70s, and you typically went away, people that were real serious about music went away from those stacked records on the old hi-fis, and you just put the disc down on a platter one at a time. So you can imagine that if you wanted to listen to a lot of Beatles music, you weren't going to be flipping around with 45s and then albums and going back, changing your speed if you wanted to listen to them chronologically. So it was very convenient to have the singles on the albums. And I think that, I appreciated that. I graduated from listening to singles at one point. I would put on albums. And once you had a decent stereo, you weren't messing around with singles. And I think that's one of the things where the industry and the record buying public demanded better quality, and that tipped the scales to the album format more than the 45s. I think that's partly why that happened. I really think it's hard to beat these two albums. Talk about two great first albums, even though these are truncated and the quality isn't what the British versions were. Boy, I don't think anybody cared. So I can't wait to do some more Beatle album reviews for you. These have been real fun. I think that it's time to look at some of these releases a little more critically, and also not just look at the things that were wrong with them, but the things that they got right. And some of these U.S. albums got a lot of things right. So as always, I thank you for watching. Pop Goes the 60s.